Welcome to another discussion of our Appalachia. It's really great to be with you again today. And as you will recall, last week we talked about the whole concept of Appalachia. What is Appalachia? Well, we're going to get a little closer to home today, and we have a particularly fascinating topic. We're going to talk, indeed, about eastern Kentucky, which is obviously near and dear to most of our hearts. And we are very fortunate in having an outstanding scholar with us, Dr. Cradis Williams. And Dr. Williams is not only an expert on eastern Kentucky, he's an expert on all of Appalachia. Indeed, he was born and reared in Lawrence County, Kentucky. Then he began his higher education at Cumberland College, finished both baccalaureate and master's degrees at the University of Kentucky, and way away he traveled to New York University to finish his doctorate. But he has a very illustrious career that we might find out more about today. Indeed, he has been for many years with Appalachian State University in Boone, North Carolina, for a time as the dean of the graduate school, and then for a time he was vice chancellor there at Appalachian State University. We might get into more of Dr. Williams' background in the course of the discussion, but today we're going to talk about the early settlement in Appalachian Kentucky. In fact, many of you might get some insight into your ancestry, the lifestyles that were prevalent in this area way before we were around, and I can think of no person better than Dr. Williams, because he is a mentor to many of us who consider ourselves Appalachian students and scholars. He indeed is viewed as a founding father, I guess, of the whole area called Appalachian Studies. So welcome today, Dr. Williams.
Well, thank you, Dr. Conn. I'm glad to be here. I don't know whether you want me just to take off or whether you have a particular question you'd like to direct to me so that you can have control on me, because I can go in all directions at once.
Right. Well, I don't want to control you too completely, but we are going to have a discussion, and I have some very important questions in my own mind I'd like you to help me with. So I'd like to start off by asking you to give me, I guess, a time frame. When we talk about the early settlement in Appalachian Kentucky, what years are we talking about? When did settlers, or I guess you would say white men, first come into eastern Kentucky, and when did they intend to stay for good?
Yes, probably most eastern Kentuckians know this, and probably most people who are not from eastern Kentucky do not know it. Actually, eastern Kentucky was the last part of Kentucky to be settled. Harrodsburg and Boonesboro and all those places we read about in the history were thriving before anybody had even dared try to live yet in eastern Kentucky, notably the Big Sandy Valley. We have historically a few things that will be of interest, I think, in addressing your question. One is that eastern Kentucky was a kind of a mystery to the people who were exploring all of the Mississippi Valley and the Appalachian region too. Those who first drifted down the Ohio River, for example, saw Indian villages on the banks of that river above Muskingum, mouth of Muskingum. They floated on down a river with mud flat banks and cane brakes along the side of it, fogs lasting far up into the day, and saw no Indian villages until they got to the neighborhood of Maysville. And in going along this river, they passed the mysterious mouth of what was sometimes called Big Sandy Creek, or just Sandy Creek, or Big Sandy River, or the Louisa River, or whatever. But it was a long time before anybody went up into that river. Perhaps the first person to see it was Gabriel Arthur, about 1674, who was going with some of the Chickasaws and the Cherokees to attack the Shawnee Indians at the mouth of the Scioto River near where Portsmouth is now located. And they went across the river then. But it was 75 years before another white man came into the Big Sandy Valley.
I see. Now, are you suggesting that Indians were not living in eastern Kentucky on a permanent basis at this point in time?
This is correct, yes.
What was the Indian activity or the Indian relationship to eastern Kentucky?
Well, the Big Sandy Valley, notably, as well as the Licking Valley, was a famous hunting ground, being shared by arrangements and understandings by the Chickasaws and oh, no, I'm sorry, not the Chickasaws, the Shawnees, the Cherokees, the Delawares, and the Mingos. They understood this, and they hunted. We had salt licks all up both rivers. We got Licking River because of the licks on it.
Of course, we're right on the Licking River and have a town called Salt Lick nearby.
Exactly.
So that's descriptive of some of the early activity around salt licks in this area.
Well, now, the Indians didn't mean for white people to settle this region if they could help it.
I see.
Because this was their source of food.
Right. And it was really by common understanding for the Indian people a neutral ground where hunting and the search for food and salt took place.
This is correct. Now, the Indians themselves sometimes warred. It was about in the 1760s. Well, Dr. Walker, of course, everybody knows, who built the first log cabin in Kentucky at Barberville, came on across the mountains and crossed the Big Sandy River. It was then flooding at Paintsville in 1750. He went over the divide on to Tug Fork and followed that river course out to its source. And he describes what the landscape was like and does very well with it. But it was up in the 1760s before anybody tried to live in the on the river, on the Big Sandy River. In the meantime, of course, everybody's heard about John Swift and his silver mines. In the very early 60s, 1761, he crossed the Big Sandy River at the fork where Louisa is now located and dispatched his men in 5 directions to go to his silver mines.
I see.
And of course, almost every farmer in eastern Kentucky is sure Swift's silver mine was on his land.
Absolutely. Well, you know, you brought up a couple of interesting thoughts to me. You've mentioned individuals coming into Kentucky by way of the Ohio River, and then you mentioned Dr. Walker, who came to Barberville.
Yes.
You're talking about different sections of eastern Kentucky. So evidently there were several points of entry. What would you say were the major access points into what is now Kentucky?
Yes. Well, of course, Cumberland Gap, people coming through there to begin with were just headstrongly bent for central Kentucky. But many of them were impressed by the rolling land, say Laurel County and some of those nice-looking counties down there, and stopped off. Others were fascinated from the beginning with the mountain land and headed for mountain holdings because they liked the game and the fish and the like. And many families traced themselves back to those first comers who were settling in there about the time Boonesboro and Harrodsburg were really being built up. However, those people who came through the Cumberland Gap rarely made it over into even Letcher County and Bell County. Those in that section came over the Pound Gap, originally the Sound Gap, because the rocks there don't have coal in them, and they have a hollow sound. There are caves under them. And
now,
some
Pound Gap,
Pound Gap.
Is that near what is now called Pound, Virginia?
That's right.
Okay.
Yes. That was another entry. And then the Breaks of the Sandy was still another. And after migration over the mountains was almost completed, there was even another route surveyed by a novelist who is associated with the life of Percy Bysshe Shelley because he had an affair with one of Shelley's women. One of Shelley's women, that's Gilbert Imlay, who was also an officer of Kentucky in 1784. He surveyed a route from Charleston, West Virginia, through the Big Sandy Valley, right straight across, crossing at the fork where Louisa is now located, on into central Kentucky. But that was surveyed so late that very few people came that way. Mostly they came through the breaks. They came, and certain people from certain sections came in these directions: the breaks, Pound Gap, Cumberland Gap, and then a little later down the river.
Right.
Now, those who came down the river didn't really penetrate very far into Appalachia. The counties along the river have pioneers who came down the river. Typically, halfway through the county that's the alternate county from the river will pretty well mark the line of settlement. And north of there or northwest of there, they will have come down the river, whereas south or southwest of there, they will have come over the mountains from Virginia or Carolina or East Tennessee And in certain sections, especially those who came through the breaks, one will find people who came out of what is now Monroe County, West Virginia, then in Virginia.
Now, people that came down the Ohio River, at what point did they begin a river journey? Was it as far up the river as, say, Pittsburgh, or was it considerably this side of that
some
area?
of them even beyond Pittsburgh.
I see. On up in the headwaters of even the tributaries of the Ohio.
Exactly. Those who came that way and settled typically were the same kind of people in general as who came from the south. But they'd come out of eastern Pennsylvania and Maryland and New Jersey. But they typically, too, were mostly Scotch-Irish folk.
Right. Well, you've mentioned now the Scotch-Irish, and this is something that fascinates me. Of course, all of us are interested in our own ancestry, and more we have genealogy buffs in this area. But what peoples, what ethnic origins were best represented in this early settlement in eastern Kentucky particularly? You mentioned the Scotch-Irish, and you might tell some of the folks who aren't big into the different ethnic groups in the British Isles exactly what the Scotch-Irish were or are.
Yes. Well, the first illusion that one must relieve himself of about the Scotch-Irish is that they're part Scotch and part Irish. They're neither. They're Anglo-Celts who were living in lowland Scotland, but whom the Highland Scots would not admit kinship to. And about the time King James I of England was having the Bible translated, they were moved over to Northern Ireland, Ulster, to replace the Catholic Irish who had been driven out.
Right.
And they were permitted to continue with their Presbyterian religion, were allowed to establish schools because the Presbyterian theological position requires that one be able to read and write and search for truth himself. And that meant then that people needed to have a degree of education, both male and female. And that was innovative because in most schools in Europe prior to that time, only boys attended. But here, the Scotch-Irish and Ulster developed these schools taught by the graduates of the universities who were the ministers of the churches. And little boys and girls both came and both learned to read and write and cipher on the basic belief, based on the basic belief that the image of God resides in the face of everybody. Therefore, it is the responsibility of everybody to learn to pursue truth according to his own light.
Right.
And so it surprises many people to know that these Scotch-Irish who came by the thousands and the thousands and the thousands were usually literate, both men and women.
I see.
And
that flies in the face of a lot of stereotypes regarding Appalachian people.
Certainly does. The Appalachian people were probably more literate from about the time they were evenly settling Appalachia, which would have been about 1790.
Right.
To about 1820 or 30. They were probably more literate then than they've ever been since, even today.
Another point you've touched on, a lot of folks are confused because they feel that somehow a Scotch-Irishman is partly Irish, and they can't understand why Catholicism never had a stronghold in Appalachia. But you're saying that Scotch-Irish were very clearly not Irish in terms of tracing their ancestry on the Isle of Ireland many, many years back. If anything, they were closer to the Scotch in terms of their cultural heritage. Is that correct?
The Northern English would probably be more accurate. They represent what we call the Celtic fringe.
I see.
Or Celtic fringe.
Right.
You may pronounce that either way. And included in that fringe are the Cornish people, the Welsh people, and those Celts that live on the border country of Scotland, but not the Highland Scots. They're a different kind of Celt.
But the people who populate Ulster at this point in time, there's a direct tie between the Ulstermen and families that are currently in eastern Kentucky.
This is
that
correct.
So many of the surnames, I guess, in eastern Kentucky have parallels or counterparts in Ulster to this day.
This is correct.
Right.
Yes, and of course some of those surnames go back to the Viking invasions.
Right.
A long, long time ago. Right. One of eastern Kentucky's biggest families, for example, and most important, influential families, has its seat at Blaine, and it goes back through the history of Appalachia. As a matter of fact, the carpenter who built Dr. Walker's house at Barberville was Richard Skaggs. And Richard Skaggs' descendants now live at Blaine and in Johnson County around Paintsville, and doctors and dentists and the like from that family are scattered everywhere. And this is a Scotch-Irish family with a name that derives ultimately from the Vikings. Scoggin meant blackbeard.
Right. Other than the Scotch-Irish, which other ethnic groups were well represented in these settlements?
The Welsh.
In eastern Kentucky.
The Welsh, especially in eastern Kentucky. But it would seem that most of them also came as Scotch-Irish. Their ancestors had migrated to Northern Ireland. And though they came to eastern Kentucky bearing such family names as Williams and Griffith and Evans and the like, many of them had come out of Northern Ireland and think of themselves not as Welsh, but as Scotch-Irish. And then there were also Huguenots that the Scotch-Irish had invited over to help them with their textile.
Now these were Frenchmen, but French Huguenots.
Yeah, they were French Calvinists. So far as religion went, they were very close together. They had no conflicts theologically. And they came and lived there 4 or 5 generations. Now that means 100 to 125 years.
Right.
And lived there long enough for the accents to move on their names.
Right.
So that though they came to Northern Ireland as cornets, when the descendants left to come for America and find the land in Appalachia, they were by that time cornets.
Right. So they had anglicized pronunciations to some extent.
Yes, Salyer is another of those fine Scotch Huguenot names.
Right.
Salyer, sometimes with an S at the end. And Kazee, spelled variously, is another of those names.
Let me ask you, the persons who came to eastern Kentucky, now did they come almost directly as immigrants from foreign lands, or had they lived previously in other parts of the colonies or the United States?
Very few of them came directly. Most of them were 2 or 3 generations away from the first comer. And they were mostly of Scotch-Irish descent, but the grandpa, for example, would have lived in Pennsylvania. The son would have made it down to Virginia or North Carolina and would have fought in the Revolution. And after the Revolutionary War was over, he took his land warranty in eastern Kentucky.
What were these individuals looking for? In other words, if they had lived in other parts of the country, what motivated them to move further west? And certainly what motivated them to find themselves in the fastnesses of the Appalachian terrain?
Land.
Yes.
The story of the Scotch-Irish is a bitter story, really. They had not owned land in lowland Scotland. They had rented on a year-to-year basis, and they were exploited so that they were among the poorest people in the world when they responded to Calvinistic doctrine just before King James won. And then they got over to Northern Ireland, they were allowed to hold land for 30 years. And they began to have difficulty in Ireland before they came on here, and more than anything else, they wanted to own land.
So the current love of the land and the interest in land ownership goes all the way back as
the first settlers.
Predisposition of these people, you might say.
Exactly.
I see. Let me ask you about the way that land was used early on, though. Were these persons farmers who wanted land to till, because of course a lot of the land is very rugged, or were they more frontiersmen who were what you might call hunters and gatherers of what might be the bounty of the land as it had been for many years?
Well, the first comers were those hunters, long hunters, frontiersmen and the like, although typically they owned land themselves, as Daniel Boone owned land on the Yadkin, and he'd hunt and go back, while his wife and children would take care of the farm for him. This was true of the Blevinses, who were Daniel Boone's guides through Cave Gap. And they have descendants all over Kentucky, too, all over eastern Kentucky. They're of Welsh origin originally, but came as Scotch-Irish. These hunters came first, and they knew where the good land was, and they reported, and families followed them and took up land close by, on which they wanted to hunt, to fish, to work the woods. They were excellent woodworkers, and of course to farm.
Once farming, though, became commonplace, and I guess it was for some from the beginning, certainly subsistence farming,
Yes.
as we used to call it.
Yeah.
But what crops were commonly grown, and what did agriculture consist of? What were the diets of the people, and what types of livestock did they prefer?
Yes. Well, I was reading the will of an ancestor of mine yesterday in the Lawrence County Courthouse. A first settler, this man was, in the valley in which I grew up. And he mentioned 19 sheep. He referred to hogs, number unknown. He gave each of his daughters 2 horses, and he would specify, this one will get the bay and the roan, the other will get the sorrel and the brown, and the like. Mm-hmm. They wanted livestock,
right,
and they had plenty of it. Hogs, cows, milk cows, sucking colts with a mare. That's what you see. This meant continuity.
Right.
They referred to all of these things, and they wanted these things, and they got them.
But sheep were common in the area in the early days. Is that correct? People ate mutton and lamb more than today, I suppose.
My recollection is that this man's will was dated in 1843. I think I'm right about that. And he had 19 sheep at that time. So they were developing their own cloth too. Now, as to what they grew, they cleared for grass whenever they could, because they needed to graze these animals. And also, it was outside stock law, so that they ate at the edge of the forest, and one could hop on his saddle horse and ride straight up the hill and down, but without any obstructions. Later on, you know, it was not easy to do that. One had to come out from out the creek and around and up. And
even hogs roamed loose.
All went wild, that's correct.
I've heard the term, as a matter of fact, a hog drover.
Yes.
And does this imply that they literally herded hogs in much the same way cattle were herded in the far west?
Yes. The drovers drove the hogs for the purchasers, who from very early days would come all through the Licking Valley and the tributaries, western tributaries of the Big Sandy Valley, and buy everything that would walk and drive it to Flemingsburg. Flemingsburg was the marketplace.
Indeed, Elliotville, it's called by most now, has been known as Hog Town. Yeah. And I understand that there were a series of pens there where the drovers kept hogs during their trek to market. So I guess they were coming out of the mountains toward Flemingsburg, perhaps.
Yeah. And inns along the way. These drovers knew of these inns, and they knew of people who had, to speak of a well-to-do mountain person, who had things hung up, you know, hams and the like.
What would you say that actually pork was more common than beef at this point because of the nature of the land and the limitation for large pastures?
Yes. I don't know when pork became the preferred meat in Appalachia. Perhaps it always was, but it still is, and there are rural people who have never eaten beef and who will not eat beef.
I see. Don't like the taste of it.
That's right. They prefer pork.
Well, I've certainly found that to be true. Now, the crops other than livestock, in other words, the grains, what were common grains in the area?
Well, they grew barley and rye and wheat. And of course, all these things were harvested the same way everywhere in the world then. Another mistake we make about Appalachian farming is that we think these people were not smart to take hillsides.
Right.
But bless your dear bones, at that very time, on the most level land in the country, planting, cultivating, and harvesting were all done in exactly the same way the Appalachian people were doing it.
Right.
It was all done by hand.
Right.
And so they grew all these things, and they had mills. Almost every farm had a mill of some kind, where the meal was ground into the corn ground into meal, and they had these mills for making flour and all the rest of it. And the farmers did not waste. They had brought with them the tradition of making whiskey.
Right.
So they made the extra grain into whiskey, and they grew apple orchards and made brandy of their apples.
I've even heard that the Big Sandy actually had vineyards, and the production of wine was common early on. Do you have evidence of that?
I can't speak historically to that, other than to say my general impression is, yes, people did grow grapevines in the Big Sandy, but how much marketing of that they did, I do not know. I do know that some very productive distilleries were located in the Big Sandy Valley.
Right.
And in my boyhood, I could still see enormous apple orchards that had been serving the distillers.
Now, you're referring to legal distilleries as opposed to moonshining.
Yeah, of course, that always
this was before Prohibition, I
Right,
think.
right. Well, now moonshining went on too.
Right,
But the self-respecting farmers who really had a lot to take care of typically had a license to distill.
Right. What counties would you say, and when I speak of counties, I'm talking about current counties, which areas were most heavily populated, let's say, by the time of the Civil War or early in the 19th century?
Well, we might back up to say Prestonsburg, Kentucky was in 1791 was built, the first house by John Spurlock, I guess, 1791. And it was the first town in the Big Sandy, and still a very small town, only 16 or so living in it by 1800.
I see.
And by the time it was safe to settle in the Big Sandy, which was not till 1795.
Right.
Now, prior to 1795, there were probably not more than 400 families in all the Big Sandy and most of the Licking Valley.
I see.
I see. Now, 1790. That's a very thin settlement.
Right.
Because the Indians were still prowling, and it was not safe to settle in the Big Sandy Valley and much of the Licking Valley until after the Battle of the Fallen Timbers in 1795.
And settlement, I guess, was widely dispersed as well.
Yes, it was.
In other words, to have a community of, say, 100 individuals was uncommon.
There was not one.
There was no such settlement.
No,
right.
no,
right.
Indeed.
Okay, so people were really looking for farmsteads and scattered throughout the region.
Right, and these people were open country people, as their ancestors had been. They eschewed cities. We didn't have any centers of population that achieved any size at all in Appalachia until recent decades.
Right, right. Well, that's fascinating. Then it's true to say that eastern Kentucky was very agrarian, very thinly populated for many, many years. And we don't really have time to get into the subsequent development of coal mining. That's a fascinating topic that I'd like to get into with you at some time. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. And, you know, this has been an absolutely fascinating discussion for me. It's given me a much better feel for the region around us, and I'm sure that all of those who've joined us by way of television are interested as well. I certainly hope you can be with us at a future time, because I know you have a wealth of knowledge on all types of topics. But for right now, I have to conclude this discussion on our Appalachia and urge you to be back with us when we take up another exciting facet of the area around us.